So now that we've got this organized in After Effects, we can start going in and doing some really basic motion and some keyframing and the things that most of you probably took this course for to learn how to do. So this is nice because now we're fairly well organized, right? So we've got our elements in here, our objects. I've went through and I've renamed some of them, right, to be a little bit more organized so I know what I'm manipulating. And they're residing down here on the timeline, and we've kind of got this we've got this visual response here in the composition, which is fairly nice, right? So I can see visually what I'm dealing with. So we're gonna go ahead and we can manipulate these individual layers to get the effects that we want, to get the visuals that we want, to animate it the way that we want. Something that you're going to be doing a lot of is you're actually going to be changing composition settings quite a lot. So the first thing that we're going to talk about here is how to change composition settings to get them properly dialed in. Underneath of this composition menu, we're going to go to composition settings for our particular composition. And we're going to pull this down and evaluate it and make sure that we're working in a format that's reasonable. So I'm going to go in here and I've noticed that 2048 by 1024 is not really the resolution I want to work at. Even though I specified differently in Illustrator, I still ended up with a different resolution here. So I'm going to change that to 1280 by 720. There's all kinds of presets that you can pull down from up here that can be very helpful as a starting point. But nonetheless, I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to change it to 1280 by 720. And I'm going to change the frame rate to 24, which is it's fairly standard in a production pipeline. You want to check really early on what the frame rate is, because sometimes people like to work at 30, sometimes people like to work at 60. A lot of times, I personally like to work at 24 because it's easier and it's a little bit less work. But it's something that you've just got to get used to checking, and you just have to nail it down early on so that you don't get caught flat-footed. Something else to look at here is that the number of frames that you want. So right now, my duration's being listed as a number of frames. That's typically how I like to think about things, by the number of frames. But this is not, keeping the frame rate in mind. I like to think about things as number of frames. But I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to press OK to just change that one option, change the resolution option a little bit. But really what I can do is by holding down Control and clicking over here, I can view this as an actual timeline in a number of seconds, which most of your interfaces will default to this. And this is fairly, as you can see, as I scrub this through the timeline, you can see that it changes, and it tells you a number of seconds, which is a little bit more relatable when you're first starting out. So let's go ahead and leave that on as the default. And then we're going to go back to our composition settings again. And now see, it's telling us, okay, well, you want a 7-second composition, right? Yeah, I'm fine with 7 seconds. For this exercise, I recommend doing like a 5-second composition, but 7 seconds is totally fine. But you can go in here and you can change the length of the composition, right? So you can change it to 5, you can change it to 25, you can change it to whatever you want. So go ahead and press OK to accept those options, right? So now we've got this, and we've crop these off just a little bit because they're a little bit larger than the composition, which is totally fine. We're going to move them all anyway. So now we can get into, now that we've got that all set up properly and our compositions configured properly, I can zoom in here just a little tiny bit to 50%, and now we can get down to the business of actually animating some of this. So now that our composition settings are right and we're organized, let's talk about manipulation and getting things keyframed. So I've got a separate objects here. First place to start out is where I can start here with a single object. So I'm going to take, for example, let's take my plane. You can move these objects up and down in layer in the layer order. This is not unlike something you're used to with, say, Photoshop or Illustrator. You can move layers up and down in their order, and as you can well imagine, the layer shows up on top of or on the bottom of whatever's underneath of it. So, it shows up on top of whatever's underneath of it. So, anyhow. Let's take the plane, for example, and let's start manipulating that the way that we want to. There's this horizontal arrow over here. If we twirl that down, we could see transform options. Now, as we get a little bit more advanced here, I'm going to be using keyframe shortcuts, or I'm going to be using keyboard shortcuts to get to all of the different pieces all the different attributes that we want to manipulate. But for the time being, I'm going to start using this menu structure just to get you used to the concept of where this stuff is kept. So twirling this down will show you the transform options. Underneath of transform, we've got some very basic things that we can manipulate about this object. And there's any number of ways that we could go in here and we can change these and manipulate them. I haven't keyframed anything yet. You'll notice that each one of these has a stopwatch next to it. So once you put the stopwatch down, it's going to put a keyframe down, and then you scrub within the timeline to set another place, and you can drop another keyframe automatically by manipulating the value. We'll go over that here in just a minute. But nonetheless, I've got different options here, and we notice that, okay, my plane is off of the screen. Maybe I want to bring it onto the screen, so I can take this position and I can manipulate it down here to get it to a place that I want. Sure. Pretty easy, right? I can manipulate the y-axis and I can manipulate the x-axis. If you think of this as a Cartesian plane that you may have studied in geometry class, then y is up and down and x is back and forth. And that's the horizontal and the vertical values, right? So you can manipulate things that way. Sometimes I prefer to do it that way. You can also go out here into the composition window and grab and drag things to give them different positions. So that's also something that's really easy, makes it easy and rather, tactile way to do stuff. So that's always an option that's available to you and may work in some instances. So you could, as you can imagine, you can take any of these and you can manipulate them. So I can scale something on a very basic level. I can transform this. I can scale it to make it larger and smaller. Now, if I make it too large, you'll notice that you get some really raggedy, jagged edges here. And that's something that we're going to discuss a little bit later on when we talk about switches and the different ways that you can make this look a little bit more professional. I didn't tell you that this was resolution independent, so I'm going to follow through on that promise. I can type values in. So say I want to get this back down to 100. I can type in 100, right? And it bounces it down to 100. Easy enough, right? So anyhow, we've got a basic idea. I can rotate something by manipulating the rotation value, right? We've done this before. And I can also manipulate, on a very base level, I can manipulate the opacity. So I can make it disappear. Maybe this is the Bermuda Triangle and it's disappearing, right? So I can slide the opacity to give it that visual effect. The anchor point is something that's a little bit different. If you've ever worked in Maya or you've ever worked in any other some animation programs, sometimes Flash, it's like this too. The anchor point is actually the point, the pivot point of where you're going to be. So say I move the anchor point up and down, I can rotate something and it rotates or moves or scales from that one point. If you've done a lot of animation already, then you understand the value of that. If you don't quite get it yet, don't worry. We'll jump into that a little bit later when we start talking about grouping and parenting and all that stuff. So anyhow, this is what we've got, and I have moved the anchor point down a little bit, right? So it's always nice to have a nicely positioned anchor point. All right, so I moved the anchor point down a little bit. Another tip for animating is I usually like to animate things backwards. In this scenario, it's not so important or critical, but if there's a certain image that I want to end up on, usually I arrange that image first. So I'm just going to dive in here and I'm going to start moving this stuff around, right? So maybe I want to, I'm manipulating the plane. I'm going to go ahead to this speech bubble and I'm going to change its scale value, right? So I'm going to scale it down a little bit so that maybe the pilot's in the cockpit talking or something. And then maybe I've got these mountains here and I want to twirl those down. I want to scale them and move them, right? And I'm used to using shortcut keys for all of this. So if it moves a little slowly, that's just because I'm trying to keep it within a pretty accessible space when we first start out. So maybe this is something that we want here as our final, right? So maybe we're gonna position that. Maybe we're gonna scale it just a little tiny bit. So there's a lot of different ways that we can do this. I can move this, scoot it over here, but maybe this is kind of the maybe this is the place where we want it to end up, right? Something also that you can keep in mind is that you can choose a title safe grid to make sure you're still in the title safe area, but also you can use a proportional grid. I've set mine up. This is something you tweak in your settings. I've set mine up to reflect the 3-point composition grid, which is really important if you want to get things properly positioned so that your audience can see them the right way. So maybe I position that on the third, maybe off it just a little tiny bit, just to direct the message towards that. And then maybe I bring this down just a little tiny bit. So I can go ahead in there and I can tweak just a little bit to my heart's content. So I'm going to tweak a little bit, and then I'll get things positioned right, and then we'll talk about animating. Okay, so I went through here and I did a little bit of arrangement to get this to something that I would consider might be an interesting final image, right? So just take a look at this proportionally. You know, I have this lined up on the third, I have this centered on the third. So we are working with some composition stuff here. This takes up the bottom third, right? So this is just basically employing some really basic composition principles. So as we work through these, we'll talk a little bit about design and how you can up the bar a little bit just by designing a little bit better and taking some of that stuff into account. Dealing with a primary color palette here too, in case you were wondering, and then the green typically just gets thrown in there even though it's not a primary color. But nonetheless, I'm fairly fairly happy with this as a final composition. So consider this to be maybe the final image that we end up with. So I was thinking it through. Maybe a cool idea would be to have these mountains and these buildings pop up from the bottom, scale them up from the bottom, and then have the plane fly in, and then have this speech bubble right here. Boop. Scale out. So we'll cover a little bit and show you how you could do this with some really basic animations, basic manipulation of attributes and things like that on each of these layers. Now, color-wise and the background being black and all that stuff, that's stuff that I would probably change a little bit later, and I'd probably do some cooler stuff with the colors and stuff. But for the time being, let's keep it basic. Like I mentioned, we're going to work backwards. So now that we have the image the way that we want, we're going to build it in, right? So we're going to have this stuff animate to build in. And this is the typical workflow of what you would do if you're working with a logo. So for your first assignment, for your first real project, you'll be doing a logo build. And it'll be critically important for you to do it backwards, really. You'll set the logo up the final, arrange it the final way that you want it. And if you're well organized, then you'll be able to just easily animate it backwards. So say I want this to build up in about 6 seconds. So I'm going to take this here and I'm going to scrub my playhead to 6 seconds, say I want the whole thing to be formed at 6 seconds. Don't panic if you don't get it right the first time. So say you end up arranging this and it's absolutely awful and horrible. You can always go back in and just move the keyframes. Sometimes it's more important to just start designing something and start working with something, and as you dive into it, you can just tweak it to get it to the place where you want. Getting a sense of timing and what's too fast and what's too slow and things like that, that's all stuff that you have to heuristically work through and get right. And it's just stuff that we'll cover through the quarter, and there's particular comfortable thresholds and stuff. But anyhow, we'll dive into this and we'll start working with just doing some basic animated stuff. So the first thing, since we're working backwards, I'm gonna have the plane fly in second, right? So the plane right now, we want the plane to end up. Actually, I think the last thing I want to happen actually is I want that speech bubble to come up, and that'll be pretty fun. So I'm gonna put the speech bubble on the top because I want it to layer over top of the plane. And what I am going to actually have the speech bubble do is I'm going to actually have the speech bubble scale. So I've moved the anchor point to the speech bubble right here, so I can actually show it scaling from that one side. Watch me manipulate it and you'll see what I mean. Zoop. See? As I manipulate the scale value, it scales to that one spot, right? So that's the effect that I'm going for, and because I've moved the anchor point down here, it scales from that spot and gives me that effect. So that's the last thing I want to have happen, so it's going to be the first thing that I actually animate. And I want this to be the scale value that it ends up at. And typically I'm finding, half second to a third of a second is typically good for, how you have a single element build. It really varies, but why don't we go ahead and do, we'll take this down to maybe about 8 seconds. That's actually 2/3 of a second. We're going to do it maybe just a little slowly just to start out. So now that I've moved it backwards, I can go ahead and I can select this and I can actually make it a scale value of 0. And as I type that in, you'll notice that it lays down an extra keyframe. To get it started, I went in here and I pressed this stopwatch. That set the keyframe down here, right here, and you can select and move keyframes and manipulate them individually. And then down here, I went to the next spot in the playhead, and then what I've done is I've zeroed it out, right? So as I scrub it, you can see it's now on my timeline. So that's the last thing I want to have happen. Then maybe the next thing I want, or the next thing I want to have or the thing I want to have happen before that is I want the plane to fly in, right? So right now the plane's at the position where we want it. Again, we're going to go in here and we're going to click our stopwatch, right? So we're going to toggle the keyframes on, and then maybe let me give it another, I don't know. Let's take it down to about 416, right? So it's another 2/3 of a second. And then another way to lay down a keyframe is to go here and go to add keyframe, right? You can reset values. Right clicking on something is a really good way to get this context menu. I use this context menu all the time. But for this purpose here, I'm going to take this inside the window. I can drag it this way if I want to move it on the x-axis, right? But alternately, I can take this and I can just grab it and just move it visually. And you can see how it's off the screen, right? So we've got that bounding box. And then we've got, we can still see where it's at even though it isn't on the screen. So watch this. That flies in, and then the speech bubble comes out, right? Pretty cool, right? So as you can well imagine, you can go through here and you can animate the rest of the elements now. So maybe I want these two to come up at the same time, but I want them to also move together, right? So the cityscape and the mountains, why don't we go ahead and pull those up next, right? So let's start with the cityscape. And another really valuable thing that you can do is you can actually, why don't we do it this way, we can actually animate both of these at one time. So now that I'm at my 416 mark, why don't I go ahead and I can go ahead and scale these by control, or actually I think you would command select them with on an apple. You can go ahead here and you can do multiple ones at the same time. This is really valuable and really helpful when you're doing 4, 5, 6 layers, but it's even really helpful if you're just doing 2 at the same time. So why don't we give that 2/3 of a second to kind of work up here. So we're actually going to scale them vertically. So it's interesting because there's this chain here, you'll notice, in the for the scale attribute. And when I unchain, like at the moment, they scale vertically and horizontally at the same time. Well, this could be a problem because that's not the way I want it to work. I want them to just scale horizontally. I want them to stay 100% I want them to stay 100% horizontally, but I want them to just scale vertically. So I'm going to unchain that, and then what I'm going to actually end up doing is I'm going to just drag that Y value, and I can drag it down to 0, and that's the same way of just having it flat with no depth, right? So watch me pull that and see. At the moment, they look like they're coming out of the ground, really, right? So that's another helpful thing. And just as it's doing that, my plane's coming by, and I've got a speech bubble, right? So pretty simple stuff, but it's starting to bring into question some of the practices of things that we use every day when we're doing After Effects. So as I'm looking at this, I'm also seeing that maybe I want to add a little bit more visual interest and add some very subtle motion just as these mountains come up and the buildings come up. I just want to have them kind of come together a little bit more to add a little bit more subtle motion there, keep it going, just keep things moving a little bit more. So one of the things that I'm going to do after the fact is I've realized, okay, now that I'm scrubbing through it, I haven't really previewed it at full force yet, but now that I'm scrubbing it, I'm seeing, I'd like for the mountains and the city to get a little bit closer together until they reach that final point. So what I would do is I would manipulate the position attribute for the cityscape and the mountains, right? So one of the things that's probably going to be helpful, though, is if I can pull these keyframes down from here to view where they're at, and then adjust accordingly to that. I would say that I actually want them to come together at the very end. They provide this really subtle element so that it's not just this herky-jerky sort of a motion. So that's one of the kind of the tricks we employ to give it a little bit more visual complexity. The eye, craves a little bit more complexity when it comes to motion. So sometimes you want to feed that a little bit and have something just moving ever so slightly. Sometimes it makes things difficult for the editor if they need to loop something, or if there's certain situations where it could be difficult for an editor if you've got very slow, subtle motion all the time. But in our scenario here, it might be helpful to kind of have this continuously moving, always looking dynamic, right? So one of the ways we can do that is we can have stuff slowly pushed together as the logo builds, and then it's got motion on all these different levels. So first thing I may want to do, I kind of have to do this blind if I'm doing it backwards since I've done my scaling. But why don't I go ahead here and I take my cityscape and I'm just going to grab it and I'm just going to move it ever so slightly to the left. You can see down here. And then my mountains, I am going to actually just position them a little bit to the right so that when they build, they just slowly start to come together like this. And you can see easily how that adds a little bit more visual interest to what we're doing, right? And if you wanted to, you can even have it continue a little longer afterwards. I can tell you already that might even be a little too quick. Say I want this to be a little bit longer, right? And that was an accident. Just disregard that. Say I want this to actually continue out a little bit longer. Well, I'm not locked into the position in time where things are. I can certainly move things left and right, up and down. I can scale them. I can rotate them here in my composition window. But I'm also able to move them in time by shift clicking on the different keyframes and actually scooting them in the timeline. So this is the reason why it's good to just jump in and lay things out and then tweak them later. That's just the creative process at work sometimes. So you just have to visualize it a little bit and then work with it that way. So there we go. I think we're ending up with something that's a little bit better. So yeah, I can scrub this and it looks great, but how can I actually, see what it looks like at the actual correct runtime? I mean, it's, it could be too slow, it could be too fast. It's really dependent on how fast I'm scrubbing it at this point. So one of the things that we will do is we'll take the work area. I can take this here and I can scoot it just so we can see what we're working in, the area that we're working in, right? So I've got right here, I've got my keyframes in this work area. So what I can do now is I can preview what I've done. And this is where the preview panel comes in. If you can't find the preview panel, go ahead and pull it down here from Window. Here it is, it's preview panel. This is really, really one of the big panels that we use all the time here. And sometimes you may get something. There's an option here to see more or less options, and sometimes you'll see less options, but really you want to pull this down so that you see the most options because it lets you go ahead and manipulate things. So if you're working with a really heavy piece, you can skip frames. That's always important, and that helps sometimes. You can also set like an artificial frame rate for it. Right now it's automatically showing it 24 frames per second. Now this is what you do all the time. You're always going to be pulling RAM previews to check your work and to see if you're any closer to where you are. And it's also important to save, right? So before I pull a RAM preview, I'm going to save it, and then I'm going to pull a RAM preview by clicking on this button here to play it back. All right. And see, it queued up really quickly. And now it's running in real time. So that's not so bad. I think that maybe this plane needs to like move a little bit more or something. We need to get a little bit more motion out of the plane. But I don't know. Actually, I kind of like it. Maybe it looks like the plane's moving, the landscape's moving, and it's making the plane look like it's moving. I could deal with that. I think it looks fine, just on a short turn. So what we did there is it basically drew all the frames out. It rendered all the frames out. Not a lot going on, so it did it really quickly, and it gave us a preview really quickly. And now I have it on loop. So of course, if I don't loop it, right, or if I tell it to ping pong rather, it's going to go back and forth. But if I tell it not to loop, it's just going to play it once and then stop. Right, but if you're pretty obsessive like I am about my work, sometimes I like to watch it over and over again just to make sure that I've got it just right. So go ahead, RAM preview often. I like the timing on this; it's not so bad. You may want to tweak yours a little bit. You may want to have it look a little different, but this is basically how you get some basic motion going in After Effects. So this is just the basic primer on how you can get that to work and how you can just do a RAM preview of it. So if I press Escape, that'll stop my RAM preview, and you can also tweak this to show from the current time, full screen. But if I pull this work area out, what it does is it's just going to RAM preview what's in the work area. If I like what I've got, which I do like what I've got, what is it? It's probably about, I don't know, 6 seconds. It's probably about 3-4 seconds long. I kind of like what we've got. It looks nice to me, and I think that that's acceptable enough for this exercise, is just to have that. Quick little tip: if you want to make something just a little bit cuter, kind of give it a little bit more visual interest. Sometimes one quick tip is to take a few frames in, or a few have something bounce, have some frames, have something bounce back to its original position. It's a little bit hard for me to articulate, but I'll just show you how it works. I can use preview to kind of walk out a few frames. I'm going to take that, I'm going to move that there, and then I'm going to walk back a few frames. And I'm actually going to size it a little bit larger than it was. So what you'll notice is you get this nice bounce, right? And you'll see that actually a lot. Once you start looking for that in motion graphics, you'll see it a lot. So that's a little tip. Have it just like a few seconds bounce back and see how that looks in RAM preview, right? So sometimes you give it that cartoon effect to have it squash or bounce back, which we are borrowing a little bit from animation and Disney in that aspect, but that's kind of a fun little tip.